our guest is Gwendolyn DuBois Shaw. She is the, I'm going to have to read this one because it's a fairly long title, the Class of 1940 Bicentennial Term Associate Professor of the History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania. She has her PhD from Stanford. She's taught at various places, including Harvard. I think most relevantly to her lecture this evening or this afternoon, she recently finished a stint of several years as the senior historian and also director of research publications and scholarly programs at the National Portrait Gallery, which is part of the Smithsonian. So that must have been an exciting time for her. And her lecture tonight or today is drawing on and based on a show that she curated. Unfortunately, she and the Portrait Gallery, like CLAFI and everybody else in the world, is consigned to online dissemination. But it does mean that no matter where you are in the country or the world for that matter, you can go see that exhibition online. It's there now, and I forget, Gwendolyn, how long is it going till?
The exhibition is up through May, the end of May 23rd, 2021.
Good. So you'll have a lot of time to see it, but I would think that
fingers crossed.
Yeah,
Fingers crossed.
You know, I'm sure that many of us will either visit it or revisit it after today's lecture with, you know, with greater sophistication and even greater interest possibly than we had before. So Gwendolyn, it's just a pleasure to have you here, and I'm delighted to introduce to everybody Gwendolyn DuBois Shaw.
Well, thank you so much. I'm in screen share. I hope you can, oh, let me, did it go to the right one? Here we go. Okay, do you have my slide up there? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me tonight. It's a pleasure to come to you through the etherwebs. I actually attended UCLA for my first year of graduate school. I was there in 91, 92. I arrived just in time for the LA riots, which were pretty traumatic for me. And I left, I went back up to Northern California where I grew up, and I thought to myself, how could I make art history, which is what I was studying in the MA program there, relevant to me after such a traumatic event? And I think after this year, which has been a very complicated, difficult one for all of us, that the exhibition that I worked on, Every Eye is Upon Me, First Ladies of the United States, really helped me to try and reconcile and kind of work through a lot of the questions about why art history is important, why portraiture is important, why the history of the United States is far more complicated than most of us tend to think it is, and how all of these things are interwoven. So I want to begin tonight, as I talk about this exhibition with you, by showing you what it looks like. And I have a fly through here so you can see the show and get a sense of just how glorious it is. Unfortunately, it is in the dark, but here we go. Let's see.
Who's that? Mm-hmm. Would you tell us who we're looking at? Well, that's obvious.
Hello.
And as is the
Okay. So I'll be talking about a number of the images that you just saw, but I want to begin by pointing out the role of lenders in this exhibition. The National Portrait Gallery has a complete collection of portraits of presidents, but not first ladies. And so we relied on loans for many of the portraits in the exhibition. I worked in close collaboration with the curators at the White House, receiving special conservation support from the White House Historical Association. And then I also worked really closely with the National First Ladies Library, which is part of the National Park Service. And it's just a little teeny tiny place. It's in Canton, Ohio, and yet it supports the history of first ladies of the United States. Presidents, as you can see on the other side of the slide, have many sites, libraries, historic sites, et cetera. And first ladies have one really, which is the National First Ladies Library. So they were really key, very important in helping us to put the exhibition together. And I was very grateful for their help. Now, the title of the exhibition comes from a quote by this woman, Julia Gardiner Tyler. She wrote to her mother in 1845, "I very well know every eye is upon me, my dear mother, and I will behave accordingly." Now, why does she have to promise her mother that she'll be good? Well, she was kind of a difficult young woman. After she came out, she debuted as a debutante and came from a very wealthy family. She was born on Long Island, on Gardiner's Island, which was owned by her family since the 18th century and is still owned by her descendants today. And she pretty quickly got herself into hot water. You see her here in this portrait by an Italian artist, Francesco Anelli, and she really presents herself very much as a kind of American princess. She even has a little diamond, a little diadem, a little tiara, headband. She's wearing all this beautiful silk with bows and ribbons, and she's very prim, proper, very beautiful young woman. She had behaved a little bit badly in her late teens. She modeled, you can see her here in this drawing, which was an advertisement for a down market department store in Manhattan, Bogart and McCamley's. The little cartouche, just about where her handbag would be, says, "I'll purchase at Bogart and McCamley's, number 86 9th Avenue. Their goods are beautiful and astonishingly cheap." Well, this really scandalized her family. And you might say, well, how did they know it was her? That inscription across the bottom with the rose, it says the Rose of Long Island. And this was Julia Gardiner's nickname. This was the appellation that described her. And so everybody immediately recognized her. And so not only was she promoting a very middle class business, but she was in the presence in this drawing of a man who was not her husband because she wasn't married at the time. So her parents whisked her off to Europe, you know, always the good cure for good girls gone bad. And she had to meet the Pope. She had to do all of these things. And then they brought her back to the United States, and she went with her father, who had been the senator from New York, the US senator. And they were in Washington, DC. She was meeting people. They were on board a new ship called the USS Princeton when a terrible accident occurred. This gun, you can see here, this this cannon, which was called the Peacemaker, exploded on deck, and several people were killed. Unfortunately, her father was one of them. Julia Gardiner was fine because she was below deck, flirting with the president, John Tyler, who was recently widowed. Well, he comforted her, and they got along quite well, and they married. It was a bit of a May-December thing. He was 54, he was 24. By all accounts, it was a very loving relationship. They had children late in his life, early in hers, and actually one of her grandsons is still living today. Very interesting kind of family line. So they married, and she slid very easily into the life of being a first lady. And I wanted to begin with her because she presents for us a very unique situation. You know, as I mentioned, the National Portrait Gallery does not have a complete collection of first ladies' portraits. Not every first lady had a portrait made of her during her lifetime, which seems like almost unbelievable today when you think about the ubiquity of images of first ladies. But Julia Gardiner is one of these women who was very well represented, not only by this portrait by Anelli, which was made into a print that was distributed. I show you that there in the center. Other oil on canvas paintings were made for her, such as the one at the bottom. And she lived at a moment when photography was just beginning to be a key mode of portraiture in the United States. So in the 1840s, when she was in Washington, she had her photograph taken in the form of very early form of photography called daguerreotypy. And so we see her here in a photograph as well. Now this is really quite rare, but she was a woman who had incredible means. Her family was very wealthy. Her husband, President Tyler, was wealthy. He presented her with a plantation estate in Virginia called Sherwood Forest. And she adapted to that very, very quickly because she had been born in New York State at a time when slavery was still legal. It was in a kind of a process of gradual abolition. She grew up with enslaved people in her household and formerly enslaved people serving her. And she was very easily, she fit very easily into the role of a Southern plantation owner. And she is the first white woman that we have in the middle of the 19th century. In 1854, she speaks publicly about, in a very strong pro-slavery voice. She publishes a letter, an open letter in the newspapers to the Duchess of Sutherland in England, who was a big abolitionist. And she says, "Leave us alone. English women need to mind their own business. Southern women take care of our people," meaning our slaves. And today we think of this as, being a really reprehensible thing for her to do and for her to say. And it was, but she said it, and she had this feeling that she could do that at a moment when other women in the country were unable to speak their minds as loudly. Having been First Lady, she was empowered to do this after she left the White House. And she goes on through the end of her life to espouse very pro-slavery, very pro-Confederate views. When she moves back up to Long Island, she flies a Confederate flag on her property there. And then she has the nerve later on to apply for a widow's pension as being the widow of a president. So she's an interesting figure, and we have her very strongly represented, whereas we don't for many other first ladies. In the exhibition, this portrait bust of Harriet Lane Johnston is the only marble sculpture of a first lady that I was able to locate. I really don't believe any others exist from the 19th century. But Harriet Lane was a very forward-thinking woman. She was the niece of President Buchanan, of James Buchanan. He was unmarried, and she served as his hostess in the White House. And when we talk about first ladies, a fair number of them, particularly in the 19th century, were not the wives of presidents. Today, we tend to think of first ladies as being the wives of presidents, but in the 19th century, many presidents either had never been married or were widowed, their wives had predeceased them. And in order to have suitable public events, they had to have a woman serve as hostess. If there were ever any mixed gender gatherings in the White House, you had to have a woman present for that. So nieces, daughters, daughters-in-law, friends of the family often functioned in this way. And so too did Harriet Lane for her uncle. Now, she has this little bust made of her, which is quite unusual. It shows her, she was a real a fashion trend setter. She had had her inaugural gown lowered a few inches in order to show more of her shoulders. And she represents that in this bust, which she commissioned from William Henry Reinhardt. She had an enormous collection of painting and sculpture. She collected American art, Native American, European American art, and later she gives her collection to the Smithsonian Institution, and it forms the core of the National Fine Arts Collection, which is now the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So we have her to thank for a number of things, and you know, and clearly she had a similar kind of sense of self as Julia Gardner Tyler in terms of representing herself and recording that representation. Now, the Portrait Gallery has not always been able to collect the portraits of first ladies because they tend to be kind of sparse. So in 2006, the Portrait Gallery began to commission portraits of first ladies, like 2006, and began with Hillary Rodham Clinton. And this was pretty much on the heels of commissioning portraits of presidents. George H.W. Bush was the first president commissioned, whose portrait was commissioned for the Portrait Gallery. And to celebrate this exhibition of First Ladies' portraits, we published a book, First Ladies of the United States, which is a companion to America's Presidents, which documents the collection of presidents. This was, in part to go along with the exhibition, but also because that is one of the key things that visitors to the Portrait Gallery request. They say, we loved seeing the presidents, but where are the first ladies? And when folks come to Washington and they go to the different Smithsonian museums, often they go to the American History Museum, which has a very, a very well-loved exhibition devoted to first ladies. It's primarily the inauguration gowns, the china, people call it the frocks and the crocs. And so this exhibition that we did, we really wanted to focus on the portraits and how the portraits can tell us more about these women. And so tomorrow in the seminar, I'll be talking with you more closely about these two portraits, which were commissioned of First Lady Michelle Obama and former President Barack Obama. And so, as you watch the presentation tonight, you can think about how different these portraits are and how different the one of Mrs. Obama is from those of her predecessors. And I just wanted to point out the portraits that are at Portrait Gallery are different than the official portraits which are in the White House. And so they enable artists to do different things. And you can see here on the right, the official White House portraits of George W. Bush and Laura Bush are much more formal than the ones that are commissioned by the Smithsonian. It gives presidents and first ladies an opportunity to be seen in different ways. Of course, the portraits in the White House really have to serve a very different function than those at the Smithsonian. And this exhibition brings together a little bit of both. And unfortunately, when it closes at the end of May, it can't travel because the portraits from the White House are not permitted to leave Washington, D.C. The only place that they can lend to is actually the Smithsonian. So I wanted to go through just a few of these first ladies. we count, when we talk about first ladies, as many as 57 different women, because, you know, some presidents had more than one wife, more than one woman who served as a hostess in the White House. But we always begin with this woman, Martha Washington. And in many ways, you know, she is kind of, you know, all First Ladies roads lead back to Martha Washington. And when she began her time as the wife of the president, there was no title that was, you know, previously decided on by the Congress. You know, this is not something that was set up. And so people called her Lady Washington, which was the way that women of her class were addressed during the British colonial period. And I wanted to use her and a number of other first ladies to think about the complexity of these women's lives and the ways that many other people were involved in supporting them, but also that their families were often far more complex than we immediately recognize. And so I bring in this, this print of the Washington family, which is based on a large group portrait by Edward Savage, which is at the National Gallery of Art. And it shows Martha Washington with her husband, George Washington. They did not have children together, but she brought children and grandchildren from her first marriage into that relationship, which the president, you know, helped her to raise her children. And so we see her here with her granddaughter and her grandson, George Washington Custis, Wash Custis, had a complicated relationship to the institution of slavery. The Washingtons owned many slaves. Martha had brought slaves from her, that she inherited from her father, from her first husband, into that relationship, including her own half sister, Anne Dandridge, who was enslaved and who was owned by Martha. And then her grandson, Wash Custis, goes on to have children both with his white wife and also with an enslaved woman who he later frees, and he frees his Black children. He gives them land. There were some very interesting articles in the Washington Post last year about his descendants and how his gift of property to them enabled them to move into the middle class and to be able to have lives that many descendants of enslaved people have never been able to have. And so when we think about reparations in the country, it's interesting to consider the ways that property inherited through these very complicated family structures permitted some people, some African descended, formerly enslaved descended people to move into the middle class, whereas the situation has been very different for many others. Another very complicated first lady, one who serves not just her husband, James Madison, but also Thomas Jefferson as first lady, was Dolley Madison. This is a woman who, you know, kind of brings many legends with her into the White House. And she's also a woman who, because of her long life, is part of the revolutionary generation of 1776, but also lives to have a daguerreotype, lives to have early photography made of her. And this portrait on the left by William Elwell is from just about the same time as the daguerreotype. And you can see kind of how faithfully he represents Dolley Madison. She was born a Quaker in Philadelphia. She always covered her head because of that. She fancied these turbans. And so peeking out of these turbans are these great dark ringlets. Even though she's in her 7th decade of life, her hair is still dark, because it's not her hair, because it was a wig, and she's using this this bonnet, this turban, to hold it onto her head. Her vanity is also on display with these lightly rouged cheeks. But if you're able to get up close on the portrait, you can see that her blue eyes are just a little bit cloudy, probably from the cataracts that she had at the time. And she is often celebrated at Portrait Gallery for helping to save another portrait, that of George Washington, the Lansdowne portrait. There are a few versions of this. The one that she saved was hanging in the White House during the War of 1812 and 1814, when the British came to sack the Capitol, when they burned the Capitol and they were headed towards the White House. Dolley Madison is credited with helping to save this portrait. And scholars today talk about that act of saving as really being much more complicated, because she did very little other than tell people what to do, but that was important too. And it was enslaved people and free servants who took the portrait down. They cut it out of its frame, they rolled it up, and they spirited it away from Washington before the British came and started setting their fires. And just given the recent events in January with the insurrectionists at the Capitol once more, it's been since this moment that sort of thing has happened. And I know that many of us, particularly art historians, were like, on tenterhooks, very terrified about what would happen to all of the art in the Capitol building. And so to think back to Dolley Madison's, kind of quick thinking about saving this portrait so that it would not be burned in effigy, which is what the English surely would have done had they gotten their hands on it. Now, she remains in Washington and in the area, and she develops relationships with other first ladies, including Sarah Childress Polk, who is the only first lady during the 19th century not to have had children. And Mrs. Polk was very focused on politics and on assisting her husband. And political machinations had been a very big part of Dolley Madison's life. She had been very adept at helping people across the aisle, politicians across the aisle, to meet and talk and get business done over a glass of wine at a reception at the White House. And she passed on a lot of that political knowledge to Sarah Polk. Both of them liked to sit in Congress and watch the debates. And these are women, and like many who would come after them, who were interested in politics, but could not participate because of their gender. And so you see in this portrait of Sarah Polk a kind of sartorial nod to Dolley Madison, who was her mentor. She is also wearing one of these kind of turban style bonnets, and you can see the tassel coming down the side. Similarly, she has these ringlets, which are very similar to Mrs. Madison's, and this portrait really is a kind of tribute to her mentor. It's done by George Peter Alexander Healy, who was one of the most important portrait painters of American presidents in the 19th century. He painted about a dozen. He only painted a few women, though, and Sarah Polk is one of them. And I think that also points to her significance, her political significance. Now, another first lady who was thwarted by her gender in her interest in politics is Mary Lincoln. And I wanted to talk about Mary Lincoln in part through the ways that she was able to, or really forced to, channel that energy, which was through clothing. Now, as I mentioned, the American History Museum has a lot of the frocks. So I wanted to choose things that had not been seen in Washington since they were worn, and were not part of the Smithsonian's collection. And so I chose this capelet, this short pink ikat dyed silk capelet by Elizabeth Keckley. Keckley was the modiste, or the seamstress, for Mary Lincoln, and she gave Mrs. Lincoln this capelet as a gift in 1861, which of course was the year that President Lincoln becomes president. It's the year that they go to Washington in this capacity, and you can imagine this relationship which Mrs. Lincoln is beginning with her seamstress at this moment must have been pretty good freebies to have started showing up along with the dresses that she commissioned. She would go to Keckley's shop 4 times a year to get her seasonal, her measurements taken for her seasonal gear. And Keckley would begin to make these. Keckley had been born enslaved on a plantation in Virginia. She was the daughter of her owner. She later becomes the property of her half sister, very similar narrative to Martha Washington and Anne Dandridge. Keckley sews at night, and she's able to earn her own freedom and that of her son. And she goes to Washington and she sets up this dress shop, and she begins to make clothes for all of the wives of Washington politicians. But she and Mary Lincoln develop a very interesting friendship. And if you've seen the film Lincoln, the Spielberg film, it's dramatized in that film. Keckley becomes Mrs. Lincoln's confidant. And because Mrs. Lincoln cannot really participate in politics in the ways that she wants to, she channels so much of her energy into clothing. And she really becomes what today we would consider to be a shopaholic. And this is a big problem for her, especially after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. And she still has a real taste for fashion, but she can't indulge herself because there isn't any money coming to her. During Lincoln's presidency, as she was commissioning these clothes from Keckley, she would have photographs taken of her wearing the clothes. And I show you 2 small carte de visites, these paper photographs about 2.5, 3 inches by 5 inches. And she would get a dress, she would get her photograph taken, she would distribute the photograph, in these clothes. There is not a painted portrait of Mary Lincoln that is verifiable. There was one which appeared in the start of the 20th century. It was later debunked as a kind of tarted up portrait of another woman, and it's difficult to imagine that a woman as important as Mary Lincoln, so important to the history of this moment, never had a painted portrait made of her in her maturity. And so we see her in these garments, and the one in mourning attire, which I show you there at the center, is especially interesting because she lost 2 sons. 2 of her 4 sons predeceased her, and to wear mourning clothes in the 19th century was a sign of wealth. Black dye, black pigment, was one of the most expensive, and so to show herself in mourning clothes and to wear mourning clothes for a year would have required a lot of money. Now, when Abraham Lincoln died, he died without a will, so her eldest son took over the estate and doled out an allowance to her, which was not sufficient. So towards the end of the 1860s, she and Elizabeth Keckley get together and they plot to have a public sale of Mrs. Lincoln's clothes as a way to bring into public light her plight. And this is part of the campaigning that begins to happen for the widows of presidents to receive pensions. And this is a very important thing. And we have, of course, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to thank for helping to change so many of the laws that precluded women from controlling our finances. And these are some of the things that first ladies had to grapple with. Now, this sale and the distribution of Mrs. Lincoln's clothes make it very difficult to authenticate clothing from her, which is why this inscription here was so valuable. Also want to mention another First Lady who was a new one to me in doing the exhibition, and one who has just kind of come into greater public light. Rose Elizabeth Cleveland, who was the sister of Grover Cleveland and served as his First Lady while he was still a bachelor before he married Frances Cleveland. But she is our first verified lesbian first lady. And she actually, after she is relieved of having to be a hostess for her brother, she and her longtime partner go to Italy. They live under the Tuscan sun. Very sadly, she dies in the influenza pandemic in 1818. Excuse me, in 1918. But today we have her letters to her partner, and it was very interesting to be able to bring this portrait of her, which was in the basement in the graphics file, into the permanent collection of the Portrait Gallery while I was there, and to be able to tell her story. And as you saw through the fly-through, there are just a few garments. There are 4 total, including that capelet. Over on the left is a gray suit worn by Jacqueline Kennedy. The gown that Mrs. Obama wears in the portrait that we'll be discussing tomorrow. And then the beautiful spangled evening gown at right belonged to Nancy Reagan. It was worn at the second inauguration of Ronald Reagan in 1985. I really wanted to bring in the Millie dress designed by Michelle Smith and worn by Mrs. Obama in her portrait to share with the public, because nobody's seen it. When Mrs. Obama chose it, it was pulled from production. So there are only, I think there are 3 of them in existence. And really, it's a very simple dress. It's more of a sundress than a gown. And you can see how kind of simple it looks on the mannequin, as opposed to this very kind of large, like, ball gown style, how it looks in the painting. But it's made out of cotton poplin, a very kind of common fabric. Most of us have that in our closets right now. And I just want to touch on this gown that Nancy Reagan wears, because I chose it out of selfishness. As a child of the 80s, I remember that inauguration, and I remember that she wore it twice. The second time that she wore it was to receive their Royal Highnesses, Prince Charles and Princess Diana, when they came to the White House. I think it was one of the only times that Nancy Reagan wore something twice in the public eye. And the dress is really quite elaborate. It's very beautiful. It weighs about 20 pounds, which is significant because Nancy Reagan was just a little teeny tiny slip of a thing, maybe 100 pounds dripping wet. And yet she was able to support this really elaborate gown. Now, when we think about Nancy Reagan's clothing, she was very politically savvy and adept at what she chose to wear. This oil and paper portrait of her by Aaron Schickler is part of the Portrait Gallery's Time collection. When Time magazine stopped commissioning portraits for the cover of the magazine in the late 1980s, they gave all of the portraits and other materials to the Portrait Gallery. And so this is part of it. It appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1985 with the title White House co-star, which gives you a sense of how important Nancy Reagan was at the time for her husband's presidency. I had forgotten when I started working on this project how much people hated Nancy Reagan. And she's a really interesting figure looking back on her, because she had a tremendous impact on how we talk about politics today. You see her in this red shirt dress, and red was her color. She wore it very frequently, and it became known as Reagan Red. That was her signature color. It was the signature color of that, of the period that they were in the White House. And then it begins to become the color of the Republican Party, as Ronald Reagan is enshrined as the modern, most revered president of the Republican Party. So we talk about Reagan red, we talk about Republican red. Today we talk about red states and blue states, right? This is because of Nancy Reagan and because of the clothing choices that she made. Now, the last section of the exhibition, see, there you can see her in that red, is devoted to a slide presentation that kind of loops around like a PowerPoint loop in the galleries that features photographs of first ladies taken by the journalist and portrait photographer Annie Leibovitz. And these are really incredible portraits. Some of them are probably very familiar to you from Vogue magazine, Vanity Fair. And Leibovitz has photographed every living first lady and some who have passed, going back to Jacqueline Kennedy. And it was great to work with her and to talk with her about the process and what it means to make portraits of these women and how complicated it is to do that in the White House, and how important those relationships that she has made with them have been over the years. We were very much hoping that it was going to be a normal year and we were going to have first ladies in attendance at the opening, which didn't happen. It was virtual, and we were hoping to be able to get them all together and have Annie take a portrait of all of them, which is her great dream. That did not happen, unfortunately, but someday I hope she's able to do that because it would be wonderful to have them together, since there are so few of them at any one moment who can be gathered. So I'm going to stop there, and I just have on the screen for you a few links that you can go to if you want to see the exhibition. Firstladies.si.edu is the standard website that goes along with it, where all of these portraits and many, many more are located. And then npg.si.edu, of course, is the portrait gallery. And then this is my website in case you're curious about other things. So I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Daniel, yeah?
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and you gave us plenty of history and plenty of art, and just so many interesting little stories. So yeah, I can't see everybody on my screen, but I see a couple of hands up. Let me go. Velma, do you want to ask your question? Because you put it out in the chat.
I forget the name of the woman, Keckley, I believe was her name, and she was a slave and the sister of a first lady. And you said that she earned somehow her freedom. And I wanted to know, how did she do it? Did she pay for it through manumission? How did she become free?
Yeah, sorry. I know I threw a lot. I threw a lot at you. So Elizabeth Keckley was not the sister of a president or anything like that, but she was born into slavery in Virginia, and when her father, who owned her, died, she became the property of her sister, of her half sister, and at night she would sew. And she would sell what she sewed, and she earned enough money to buy her own freedom and that of her son. And then she goes, and then she goes to Washington and she sets up her own shop, and she makes dresses for the wife of Robert E. Lee, and all of these politicians, and she's right there in the mix. And she develops this friendship with Mary Lincoln, who's a very frustrated woman. People talk about her as being crazy and as being headstrong, and I really believe that she was very frustrated by her inability to participate in the public sphere as anything other than an ornament for her husband. And so she channels so much of her energy into clothing and into her appearance, because that's all she has the permission to do. And she and Keckley become very close as friends. But it's not a peer relationship, right? It's sort of like I love my manicurist. My manicurist is great. I love my hairdresser, but it's a service relationship, right? It's just a little bit different, but they understand each other, and they forge a bond. And Keckley sticks by her. she sticks by Mary Lincoln when so many other people don't, and she's there to support her. And it's very interesting to think about the ways that you know, these women have first ladies have these relationships, these support systems that you know, that are very necessary. And you know, and it really, you know, it really tells a story of the country that very, you know, it surprised me. I wasn't prepared for how much compassion I would have for so many of these women.
Thank you. My second question, Dan, is to ask our guest whether she is related to Mr. DuBois.
To W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yes.
I am named in honor of him, and Gwendolyn is for the poet Gwendolyn Brooks.
Okay.
Yeah,
Good.
but
Okay.
no, I'm not. But I use it because just in case.
Lovely.
Because why
Thank
not?
you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Jonathan, and you're good.
Yes, unmuted. I really don't have a question. My reaction was a thumbs up. I just wanted to say thank you very much. Wonderful presentation. Greatly appreciated.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Thanks again.
Everybody will join in that, and we'll all do it together at the end. Lucia, I don't see you on my screen now, but you had your.
I was also clapping,
okay.
but it's hard to tell maybe the difference between the clapping and the hand up. I'm going to keep thinking about a question, but I really appreciated getting to hear this talk. It looked like maybe Joyce had a question though. I couldn't tell.
Yes, I felt it was a very interesting presentation. It's just that I don't remember people hating Nancy Reagan. I mean, maybe it's because, let me explain something. I'm a Republican. I'm a conservative. So I'm not liberal. I'm not Democrat. So I think if you're a liberal and a Democrat, you're going to hate Nancy Reagan. If you're a Republican and a conservative, you're going to like her. So you're coming from a perspective of a liberal Democrat.
May I add that, remember Nancy Reagan dressed up as the poor woman or something and made kind of fun of herself?
Secondhand Rose. Yeah,
Yes,
she sings Secondhand Rose.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I worked in the White House for the Reagans, and I do remember those times when she was not appreciated, but I think she became appreciated.
She suffered greatly at the hands of the press, and part of that was around the China service that she ordered.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, when people go to dinner at the White House, they like to take a souvenir home, and she found that she couldn't seat 20 people with a complete service because the China had all been stolen over the years. And so she ordered a set of China that cost about $400,000. It was paid for by donations, but she was ridiculed for that. People were very angry about that because it was a very difficult time in the country. And in the collection of the Portrait Gallery, there are a lot of caricatures, very derisive caricatures of Mrs. Reagan that were collected. One of my former colleagues there, Wendy Wick Reeves, has a great love of caricature and cartooning, and she has documented the vitriol that was directed at Mrs. Reagan. And that's what I was saying I had forgotten. I wasn't aware of how much visual culture there was, absolutely deriding her. And I developed a lot of compassion for Mrs. Reagan. Here was a woman whose husband was almost murdered, was almost assassinated the first year that they were in the White House. She was terrified after that he was going to die. She would lay, awake at night, worried that he was going to die. And this kind of trauma was a part of so many of these women's lives. And in retrospect, we can look back at them and have a lot of empathy for them. And regardless of who we vote for today, these are human beings. And so it was very interesting because I think that we, just as the Reagan era has become a kind of idyllic one in the kind of conservative narrative, it was very complicated in that moment. And so it's interesting to look back and think about it.
Well, just like the Kennedys, it was like Camelot, but it was kind of kind of messed up too, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I wonder whether part of it might be that Nancy Reagan was perceived, at least, as being more engaged with political and governmental issues, perhaps than a number of other first ladies were, and therefore, it's natural that, and as is true of many
Yeah.
in American history, it was a very polarized period history. We're still living.
That was a critique, that was leveled at a number of first ladies, such as Edith Wilson. When Woodrow Wilson has a stroke after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, she protects him, and she won't let anybody but his doctor into his sick room. And then there's a photograph that we have in the exhibition, which shows him at his desk signing a form, and she's standing over him. And they're very careful not to show the left side of his face where he has been paralyzed by the stroke, so that it won't appear as though she's calling the shots. And she was very, very, she was critiqued very severely by the press, because they thought that, is the president really in charge? Is this woman, the one who's running the country? And so this was something, Eleanor Roosevelt had to face the, very, very similar thing. And there are these first ladies in the middle of the 20th century, like Mamie Eisenhower, who are very responsible for kind of turning back that clock in terms of the role of the first lady. She was the homemaker in chief, right? Mamie Eisenhower, and put pink doilies all over the White House. It's because people were reacted very negatively when they thought Edith Wilson might be in charge.
Yeah, of course,
that was Reagan.
I heard Nancy, I'm sorry. I just want to say, I heard Nancy Reagan didn't even cook. So there you go.
Probably not. Yeah, neither.
That's what I heard. She cannot even cook.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else who?
Julia Dent Grant. Julia Dent Grant, when she was asked to contribute to a cookbook, she submitted a recipe from a friend.
Is there anyone else who wanted to ask a question? I'll ask you one.
Wanda.
Oh, Wanda. Did you?
Wanda and Joe.
Wanda, did you have something? You're muted, Wanda.
Yeah. Okay, but you have several hands up, Danny.
Oh, I don't.
I'm
here.
Oh, I see. Okay. They're on the.
Okay, but I'll be quick. So, Gwendolyn, I was wondering, in my lifetime, it was really Michelle Obama who made me aware of the restrictions and difficulties of being a first lady. It wasn't something that she yearned to be. She learned how to do it, and she did it obviously very well. But I think we're more conscious now of the responsibilities, but also the coverage, the celebrity coverage, but also the expectations of first ladies. And I just wondered what for you, you've taken a long journey, you've done tremendous amount of work in researching each of these individual lives. So what are the big revelations for you about the job of first ladies?
Well, I was struck by, so many of these women became first ladies, because of a tragic accident, right? If you think about Betty Ford, who is kind of my new favorite modern first lady, she never imagined that she was going to be first lady. Her husband had not run for president, for vice president. He had been appointed, and she all of a sudden found herself, going from being a suburban Washington housewife into being first lady. And yet she accomplishes so much. She's very upfront about being pro-choice. She's pro-ERA. She speaks frankly on 60 Minutes about premarital sex that her adult children are probably already having. And she, when she battles breast cancer, she makes that public, and she lets the cameras into her sick room after she's had her mastectomy. Because of her openness about that, millions of women's lives have been saved through screening. And then after she leaves the White House, she's also very frank about her battle with with alcoholism and prescription drugs that were prescribed because of the pinched nerve in her neck. And, you know, we have a whole, you know, recovery industry that in part is, you know, spawned by the Betty Ford Clinic. And that kind of story, you know, has a lot of corollaries going back in time. Grace Coolidge, when Warren Harding dies, all of a sudden Grace Coolidge is first lady. First thing that the White House does, because the press, the mass media and newspaper and magazines are really ascendant in that moment, publishing photographs. And so they bring her into a room in the White House and they sit poor Grace Coolidge down and they make her do the most demeaning things. They make her arrange flowers, and she's there in this photograph. She's like, okay, I'll arrange the flowers. And then they're like, okay, read a book. And she's there and she's reading. She's like, okay, I'll read a book. And then they make her darn socks. And there's this picture of her darning socks, and she's like, no, I don't darn, like, I don't want to do this. And she had no choice. And many of these women were not expecting to be, you know, thrust into this role, or not to have the ability to control what they were doing, and felt that that their lives were, you know, all of a sudden being thrust into the public view and being dictated by a lot of other people. She ends up being a very good sport, you know, and most of them are, but some of them, you know, just like absolutely hate it. And the portrait that we have of Pat Nixon, you know, Pat Nixon looks so sad. She always looks so sad. And I think that she's one of these first ladies who just had a very rough time of it, and was very committed to her marriage, committed to supporting her husband. And so, you know, she did what she needed to do. Before Mrs. Obama, actually, I think Pat Nixon was the most traveled first lady. As the second lady, she traveled throughout the world and did a lot of interesting things. But it's interesting to see how, you know, how so many of them made lemonade out of the lemons that the situation gave them. You're on mute, Daniel. Shall I call on Richard? I see Richard has his hand up.
Yeah, Richard.
No?
Well, yeah, Richard and Robert, who I think is Bob Hirschman. So let's start with Richard. And Steve, I don't know if Steve Balch is still with us. He was the other one who had the blue hand. But let's go to Richard first.
I just wanted to ask about cartoonists. You know, was it considered during cartoonists for first ladies to be kind of out of base, not to go for it? Or were they liable to be caricatured as much as their husbands were?
In the 19th century, first ladies seem to be off limits. There's only one first lady who makes appearances in popular magazines, and that's Frances Cleveland. She's in the White House twice. You know, the Cleveland presidency is the only one that's like separated by the term of somebody else. And she is very quickly taken up by the press. They use her image in all sorts of endorsements that she had nothing to do with. Illustrations appear that show her with President Cleveland. They never name her though, but she's clearly the president's wife, and she's with him. In the 20th century, you begin to see a little bit more of this, but many of those just, you know, they haven't really been collected. When my colleague Wendy started collecting these, it was in the 70s and the 80s. They present, though, a very difficult thing. Like, the Portrait Gallery does not collect many caricatures and cartoons now, because it can be they can be very delicate, because some of them are so negative, you know. For example, with the Obama presidency, the risk of doing a very, very derisive, derogatory racial caricature in representing either President or Mrs. Obama was so high. And I've seen some of these that, that are like just on the edge of being, totally despicable representations, that collecting them has kind of tapered off because some of them are just awful, and they're the strategies that that artists use, they don't always stand up to stand the test of time. So it's mostly first ladies have kind of been off limits, but starting in the last quarter of the 20th century, you begin to see them.
When did they become surrogates? Sort of like nowadays, like a first lady is like kind of a surrogate almost, but when did they first start?
Well, it depends in different, in different roles. Certainly Eleanor Roosevelt was a surrogate for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She flew all over the world, during the Second World War, visiting troops. She was his legs when he couldn't be. And you see Rosalind Carter serving as an envoy, very officially as an envoy to South America during President Carter's administration. And she's the one who, it's a little more official with her. By the Clinton era, the public is just like, we're not going to tolerate that, right? And we see that very strong reaction that Hillary Clinton gets when Bill Clinton says he's going to put her in charge of healthcare reform. There's so much pushback against that. So there's a real withdrawal of that kind of labor by first ladies after Hillary Clinton. You see, they just, don't want to be, raked over the coals like that. However, Laura Bush, for example, really becomes like the comforter in chief after 9/11. And she serves an interesting role, but it's not, as official in that, in the same way that it was for Mrs. Carter, who was, definitely anointed as an envoy to speak on behalf of the president, which was very rare.
Thank you.
Okay, Robert. Is Robert here? I don't see you on my screen, but I see you on the list.
Yeah, but I think you're not muted, but the volume isn't there. Maybe you need to turn up the volume.
Oh, there he is.
Where?
Bob, we can't hear you. Or Leslie.
You're muted.
No, they're not muted, but we can't hear them for some reason.
Oh,
You want to type the question in the chat?
no, I can't hear.
Well, maybe they can type something. Let me ask you a very specific question that you can probably answer pretty quickly. Are there plans underway for a portrait for Melania Trump?
I'm sure there are. And thankfully, I'm not involved. I'm glad that I'm not involved. I understand that the discussions are underway. One of the things that the Portrait Gallery likes to do is to kind of get that moving before the end of the first term of a president, to ensure that it happens, because once the first couple leaves the White House, it can be very difficult to track them down. The curators at the White House are fantastic, but they have to go through several layers to communicate with the first family. They work through the White House usher, so it can be a very slow process. So I'm certain that it's happening, but I don't have any information on it. The White House Historical Association also, goes through the same process, and so I think that all of that is being coordinated right now. In the exhibition, Mrs. Trump is represented with a photograph that is that was the official White House photograph of her, and the White House provided that to us. They printed it, they framed it to her liking, and they sent it over on a truck, and we hung it on the wall. There are a fair number of other photographs that were in the exhibition of First Ladies, because not every First Lady has been represented in a painted portrait. And I don't believe that Mrs. Trump has had a painted portrait made of her. She, of course, was a model and is familiar with photography and knows and loves the camera. And the Trumps have a family photographer, Regine Maho, who did that photograph and who photographs them pretty regularly. So there are plenty of images of Mrs. Trump out there. It'll be interesting to see what kind of formal painted portrait she chooses to have.
Leslie, do you want to try typing something in, or I just can't hear you, unfortunately. Anyone else? Let me just give you a very general question, which I suppose could be the topic of another lecture, but maybe you can just, say one or two things in response to it. You've been pondering these portraits, with such care. Do you see trends, starting from Martha Washington and going up, let's say before Michelle Obama, because this one, we'll be talking about that tomorrow, some of us, and that one, is recognized as, in some ways at least, a break from the, so let's say through Mrs. Bush, from starting with Martha Washington, are there trends in how the artists approach the portraits and just in how the portraits are made that are worth pointing out?
I'm going to share the screen again. I want to show you one portrait which I didn't talk about, but that I think is really interesting. Let me just go through. Okay, so these are two portraits of Barbara Bush, and this one over here on the left was the first official White House portrait that was made of Mrs. Bush, and she didn't like it. She was not very happy with it, but she was such a considerate and well-bred woman that she didn't say anything about it. But her family, her son, her daughter-in-law knew that she didn't like it. It showed her as, kind of matronly, kind of dowdy, but she didn't want to tell the artist that she disliked it. So George W. and Laura Bush knew this, and when they were in the White House, they commissioned this portrait that you see at the center here, and I show it to you in the frame on the right. They commissioned it. It's by the artist Chaz Fagan, and it is now the one that hangs in the White House. The other one was taken off view, and I won't tell you who that poor artist name was, but the artist passed away, and Mrs. Bush, Mrs. Laura Bush, commissioned this portrait of her mother-in-law and of her fellow First Lady. And you can see the difference in these two portraits. It's really quite striking how much presence Mrs. Bush has in the second portrait. She looks far more strong and powerful, forthright, very direct, less like less like a kind of passive grandmotherly type, and more like a matriarch, and the female center of a dusty. Both portraits have very similar objects in them, right? One of her, beloved spaniels is next to her in a photograph, in a picture next to her on that bookcase, and is right next to her in the portrait. Her beloved pearls are around her neck, etc. But she just has a very different presence in the portrait by Chaz Fagan. And one of the things that I love about the second portrait is in the frame. If you look in the corners of the frame, there are books. that are part of the decoration of the frame. And that is in tribute to her great accomplishment. She was very dedicated to literacy. And it's been 30 years now, actually this year, that she founded the Barbara Bush Family Literacy Foundation. And so that's present in the frame of the portrait. And Laura Bush, in helping to make this happen, she was also a very committed to the legacies of first ladies. And a number, it was, I forget which first lady started displaying portraits of first ladies, but it was a first lady who made that decision to display portraits of first ladies in the White House. And Laura Bush was very concerned with the presentation of these portraits. And she had the, let me go back. Did I stop screen sharing? Yeah. Let me go back through here, and just if I go back up to the first one, and then I'll bring it back up. You can see. Okay. So this portrait that you see here of Lady Bird Johnson, Laura Bush chose to have the room that the portraits were displayed painted the same color yellow as Lady Bird's dress. And this was really important when shortly before Lady Bird died, her daughter, Linda Bird Johnson, brought her to the White House. And Laura Bush was able to say to her, she brought her in, Mrs. Johnson was no longer able to speak, but she was in a wheelchair, and she brought her into the room where the portraits were displayed. And she said, you know, as a affection, right, she said, you know, Mrs. Johnson, I wanted to make sure that your portrait really stood out. And so I had the room repainted in order to match your portrait. And I felt that this was very touching, and it really spoke to the ways that the relationships that these women have with each other, the respect that they have over time for the struggles that each other had, and how they want their legacies, how they want their portraits to be respected and to be, treasured and revered, and, you know, giving that respect to their predecessors in the hope that it will continue to pay forward.
Thank you. Okay, Leslie, who is Bob's wife, did send in something on the chat. She says, it's Leslie Hirschman here. We can't turn on the sound. My comment, one, Gwendolyn, I want to compliment you on your very interesting presentation. Two, my question, can you please share your opinion about the controversy Ray, Michelle, and Barack Obama's portraits? I would say, Leslie and or Bob, if you'd like to hear more about that, just send me an email after this, and I'll enroll you in the seminar. There are some spaces, and you can hear a lot on that. I don't know to what extent you want to be a spoiler of yourself for tomorrow, but if you'd like to say anything here about that, Gwendolyn, you certainly can.
Yeah, sure. Well, you know, those portraits are, they're so unique, and they, here, I'll just bring them up on the screen. They're really a departure from much of what hangs in the adjacent gallery. So President Obama's portrait in the America's Presidents wing has had pride of place in one entrance, George Washington at the other, and then Obama until I think like last week or something, they just moved him over to a side wall so that they can install a photograph of President Trump, of former President Trump in its place. Which I have to say kind of broke my heart, because before I left, we had installed a portrait of John Lewis directly facing President Obama's. And of course, John Lewis was a big mentor of President Obama. And I thought it was a really great juxtaposition to have them looking at each other. So now that's not there anymore. It makes me kind of sad. But the portrait of President Obama has been one that has attracted a lot of attention because it looks so different from all of the other portraits in the galleries. There are a few portraits of presidents that are abstract. There's a portrait by Elaine de Kooning of John F. Kennedy, which is a very abstract portrait. And then there's one of Bill Clinton by Chuck Close, which is kind of like pixelated big abstraction on the wall. So with the exception of those two, all of the other portraits of presidents are very kind of predictable in their conservative compositions and clothing. Most of them, are wearing suits. Of course, the one of George W. Bush, he's in a camp shirt. He was at his ranch in Texas when he had that portrait made, but most of them are very formal, and certainly the background for the portrait of President Obama is very different, and it brings together a lot of kind of emblematic features. All of the flowers in the background have meaning and are attached to different moments in his life. The multicolored chrysanthemum is the official flower of Chicago, where he had his political start. The white jasmine alludes to his part of his youth in Indonesia, etc. And so there are these aspects that tell a story that are part of it. But the way that he emerges out of this kind of wall of flowers, foliage is really unique and quite different. And then it also has a way of capturing his kind of openness and his candor as he leans forward with his arms on his knees, kind of staring like directly, very empathetically at the viewer. And it provides an interesting contrast to the portrait of Mrs. Obama, where she's really taken out of time and space. That blue background, which is behind her, is kind of a celestial blue, a sky blue. So she's, not only is she in a pyramidal form, this triangular form, she's like at the top of the mountain, but she seems to exist totally out of our space, as though she's in a kind of heavenly realm. And then the way that her gown, fills the rest of the space, making her into, a very kind of large and monumental figure. Of course, as I said earlier, the actual dress is a much more kind of modest sundress, like a maxi dress. But here it really makes her seem like, a very kind of solid form. And yet she's in this space, this kind of ethereal, sky-like space. And then that pattern on the dress is one that connects with the history of women and textiles in the country, the history of quilt making, which runs through a number of American cultures, but especially for African American women's history. And both Mrs. Obama, Amy Sherald, the artist, and the designer Michelle Smith recognized in this pattern the Gee's Bend quilters of Alabama, of central Alabama, who are well known for working with scrap material to make these really amazing geometric and kind of quasi-modernist quilts. And so Mrs. Obama, in her choice of this clothing, she's looking back at the power of the needle, which is one of the things that I talked about a number of times, like with Elizabeth Keckley, for example, but also with the suit, the wool suit that I showed you for just a hot minute, that Jacqueline Kennedy wore. Mrs. Kennedy had all of her clothes made in Manhattan by a dressmaker called Chez Non, and the clothes were made from patterns that were permitted by Chanel or Givenchy and other French fashion houses. They permitted their patterns to go to New York to this dressmaker. They sent over the fabric, they sent over the buttons, everything, so that Mrs. Kennedy could have her garments made in the USA. And that power of the needle, the role of clothing, the role of seamstresses, of textiles in First Ladies' lives are, really important. And all of that is kind of, wrapped up in this portrait as well. in the with the recent inauguration, there was so much discussion, you know, about what people were wearing, and there was even a moment when people were talking about Joe Biden and Douglas Emhoff, you know, and that their suits were by Ralph Lauren. And that's kind of all you could say about what the guys were wearing, right? You know, that they were in Ralph Lauren. But with women, there's so much more that gets talked about with the fashion. And you really see that in this portrait. That's the short version.
Okay.
May I say something?
Yeah. Can you get
I think
can you get rid of the share screen, Gwendolyn, so we can see?
Oh, yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Well, it's a bit late now. I wanted to point out that the two portraits are reversed. You can tell by the forms, and also traditionally in portraits of married couples, the man is always on the dexter. So, and you could tell by the forms that she's meant to be on the right and he is meant to be on the left. And in fact, traditionally, the left side is the more important side. It's called the dexter, and dexter because it's on the right hand of God, if you're going to go way back to the Middle Ages, etc. I'm an art historian, by the way, Gwendolyn.
I know you are.
So perhaps for the seminar, you'd reverse.
Sure, happy to. Not a problem.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else who wanted to ask a question? If not, let us again give our thanks to Gwendolyn just for such an educational and entertaining couple hours. Thank you very much.
It was a lot of fun.
And some of us will see you again tomorrow. Look forward to that. And for the rest of you, or all of you, join us the first Friday in April with Michael Lewis, architecture critic of the Wall Street Journal, talking about how to judge architecture. That should be fun also. Thanks, and good evening to all of you.
Thanks a lot, Dan.
Thank you so much, Gwendolyn. It was exceptional.
Thank you.